Dialogic. People often use this term to refer to dialogues in education, but I think it has a more useful and more specific kind of technical meaning. Dialogues have two sides to them, so you could research them as if from the outside. You could see them as something physical, located, with real words being spoken as vibrations in the air that you can record, and then you can perhaps do some sort of analysis to get at the exact meaning of the dialogue. That's looking at dialogues as if from the outside, and it's also possibly approaching them in a very monologic kind of a way. The word monologic, as it suggests, means a single voice, the idea that there's one true perspective. And a lot of education is understood monologically. It's understood as trying to teach this true representation of things to children or students, who will then be able to repeat it in exams. A transmission of a single perspective, if you like. Dialogic is a way of trying to understand meaning on the inside of dialogues. So, from the outside you might see, say, three children talking in a classroom, but if you participate in that dialogue from the inside, they might be talking about many different spaces, many different times. If you like, the space and time on the inside of the dialogue is constructed within the dialogue, and it can't be simply determined by saying, well, it's occurring in New York, or it's occurring in Russia, or it's occurring in this particular year. That might be significant, but it won't define or determine the nature of the dialogue. Why is that context significant? Because it enters into the dialogue dialogically. That's to say, people aren't determined by their space and time, but they probably will engage with the context in the things that they're saying. So that's another aspect of this dialogic space. One aspect is that there are always multiple voices in play. There's never any fixed meaning. That to understand anything in a dialogue, you have to understand, why somebody said it, who they said it to. It makes sense in a context of multiple relationships. It doesn't just make sense in itself, in abstraction from that context. So it implies multiplicity. But another aspect is, as I said, this dialogic relationship beyond talking simply to the other person. People are, in a sense, referring to the horizon of meaning around them. I mentioned it as the context, but you could also call it otherness in general. So that in a dialogue you might well implicitly invoke a generalized version of your community. You might well say, well, you might not agree, but any reasonable person would see it this way. Everybody knows this, or everybody thinks that. And that's when you're personifying your community as a specific virtual other in the dialogue. George Herbert Mead referred to this sort of move as the generalized other, so it's very important for the way in which we learn to think. But I'm also arguing that beyond that, there's a kind of horizon of otherness in general, which is infinite, which is unbounded, which simply means that whatever consensus you arrive at, whatever virtual other you construct, there's always a possibility of questioning that. There's always another voice, and one can try and be open to those possibilities and be open to the infinite nature of the potential meaning in a dialogue. And there's another aspect of dialogic space which is kind of mysterious but important, and that is the difference between voices in a dialogue is not something that you can reduce or fill in or even understand, because it's actually the context that makes meaning possible. There's always a difference between perspectives. Everybody will interpret what they hear in their own way, depending on their own experiences. And this isn't necessarily a problem, because it means that dialogues are always open and always creative. They're characterized, if you like, by misunderstanding as much as by understanding. And that misunderstanding comes from this gap, this difference between people, which is an irreducible gap. I can never be you, you can never be me, and so on. But that means that dialogues actually arise in that space of difference, which makes them possible. And dialogic space is actually, in a sense, always within that empirical space of difference, and it never escapes from that space of difference. It's characterized by difference. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well, but I suppose it's quite a complicated idea, but I think it's rather important. And these three characteristics, the multiplicity, the importance of the gap or the difference between voices, and the importance of dialogue with otherness in general and with infinite otherness, can help us to make use of dialogues in education and to understand better what it might mean to teach thinking, to teach creativity, even to teach wisdom. It's very hard to understand these seemingly intangible things if we approach them monologically, if we try to describe them in terms of pin-downable content or pin-downable skills. It's really not as simple as that. Actually, to teach thinking is to expand the dialogic space. The more you can hold different perspectives together in tension, the more likely you are to have new creative insights which will help you to see things in new ways. And of course, the more you can deepen and expand the dialogic space and see things from multiple perspectives and question the narrow framing assumptions which limit your possibility of seeing, perhaps the wiser you will be. So one possible aim of education is not simply to teach stuff, and although that's probably very useful in many contexts, it's also to teach dialogue itself as an end in itself. And by doing that, metaphorically, you might say, education has the role of expanding the dialogic space.